So do you recognize how perpetuating vaccine skepticism or especially propping up anti-vax influencers can lead to such devastating health consequences?
No, the best evidence, first of all, I had nothing to do with the drop off in vaccination rates in Samoa.
Well, there was the AP did an interview.
Let me just
Sure. Let me just say the AP did interview folks who were working on the Samoan measles response, and they said that the credibility that you gave to the anti-vax population, the anti-vax forces, did have an impact.
In today's video, Tyler Cohen absolutely destroys Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in a heated debate on vaccines. Brian hit him hard on the facts, calling out the danger of cherry-picking rare cases and spinning them into a fear campaign, especially during a global pandemic. While RFK Jr. tried to frame it as a fight for medical freedom, Brian made it clear, we're talking about a vaccine that saved millions of lives, not a fringe theory. RFK Jr.'s argument against mandates sounds nice on paper, but Brian pushed back on the reality. When public health is on the line, leadership matters. You can't claim to be pro-science and then cozy up to MAGA voters by stoking anti-vax conspiracies. This wasn't just a clash over policy. It was a spotlight on how RFK Jr.'s positions have strayed into MAGA talking point territory. Tyler Cohen didn't just call him out. He exposed how dangerous and misleading that rhetoric can be. So let's dive in and watch how Tyler Cohen shuts down RFK Jr. in this heated debate.
Well, those were people who were in Samoa.
But there's plenty of data on the drop-off. The vaccine was banned before I went to the country. So the drop-off that you saw did not change between the time I left the country and the time the measles epidemic. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the deaths that occurred, the best evidence shows that the deaths that occurred from measles that year were a result of a defective vaccination. The people who died were people who got the vaccine while they had measles, which you should never do. In Tonga, which is next door, which also had a measles outbreak and where they were not given the vaccine, there were no deaths. Oh, of course, the vaccine cartel and the public health cartel that likes to propagandize on this issue points to this and say, oh, the deaths occurred because lowered vaccination rate. But there is no data that shows that. There's no paper that shows that. There's no science that shows that. There's just propaganda. And the best science indicates that the actual reasons for those deaths in Samoa were a defective vaccine that was brought in from Australia and was pulled when the public health authorities realized that it was killing people.
But that's not what the evidence says. The evidence says that it was actually two vaccines that were mixed with an expired muscle relaxant.
You know what? No, that is propaganda. That is propaganda, and there was a series of deaths that occurred from vaccines, from the MMR vaccine prior to that, and a series of injuries, including in the prime minister's own family. And that's why he made the decision long before I went to Samoa to ban the MMR vaccine in Samoa.
Donald Trump has come out and said that he wouldn't fund schools that mandated certain vaccines. Do you agree with that decision?
Yeah, I do.
Now, RFK Jr. tried to downplay his role in the Samoa measles outbreak, saying the vaccine had already been banned before he got there and that the deaths were due to a defective batch. But Brian wasn't buying it, and neither should anyone who's looked at the actual data. In 2019, Samoa had one of the worst measles outbreaks in recent memory. More than 80 people died, mostly children. And yes, the vaccine program was temporarily suspended in 2018 after 2 tragic deaths caused by human error, not the vaccine itself, but nurses improperly mixing it with expired muscle relaxant. That mistake led to panic and a huge dip in vaccination rates. But what made it worse? The anti-vax rhetoric that followed, including from people like RFK Jr., whose visit to Samoa only amplified public distrust. Samoan health officials and international organizations like UNICEF and WHO have both pointed to vaccine hesitancy as the key factor in the outbreak. Brian called out the core issue here. Promoting vaccine skepticism has real, deadly consequences. And while RFK Jr. tries to position himself as a voice for medical freedom, he constantly leans on misinformation, cherry-picked incidents, and debunked claims. While the science is clear, vaccines save lives. The CDC, WHO, and every major medical association agrees on that.
I want to say this. My vaccination policy will not take away vaccines from anybody who wants access to them. My only issue is they should not be mandated. I don't think any medical intervention should be mandated. And let me just say this, that right now, the CDC is recommending the 9th COVID booster. Oh, that's their recommendation. 90% of Americans have made a decision not to take it. Do you think that the federal government should do what they did with the first booster, which is to tell people, okay, you can't work, you can't travel, you can't get on an airplane, you can't go to your job unless you do what CDC says? So I don't think that most Americans want that. What I want is good testing, good safety testing for vaccines, good efficacy testing, so that everybody knows, can make informed consent about whether they want this product or not, whether it's good for their age group, whether it's good for their cohort, whether it's good for them. And let's do the same kind of safety testing that we require for other drugs. And we don't do that for vaccines. Vaccines are exempt. The only medical product that's exempt from pre-licensing safety studies. And of the 72 vaccines now mandated for our children, not one of them has ever been tested in a pre-licensing safety study. That's just wrong. We know people get injured, and that's who I'm concerned with. If you're fine with it, if you've gotten a good result, you should be able to get it. We ought to be not telling people when they're injured that it didn't happen and gaslighting them and punishing doctors who report injuries. We should be doing good science, and we should be supporting people who actually get injured by these products.
I think I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but the numbers are pretty clear in terms of the efficacy and the safety of this COVID vaccine, and it was used on the biggest on the largest scale of any vaccine in America in the history of the world, and again, those numbers are pretty clear in terms of the efficacy of this vaccine, in terms of the number of hospitalizations and deaths for people who didn't get the vaccine versus those who did get the vaccine.
Okay, Brian, you know what? You're talking about data that does not exist. And I'll just tell you a couple of things.
Before he tells a couple things, RFK tried to play the "I'm not anti-vaccine, just anti-mandate" card, which sounds reasonable until you realize that he immediately followed it up with a flood of misinformation. He claimed vaccines are exempt from pre-licensing safety studies, that none of the childhood vaccines have ever been properly tested, and that we don't have data on COVID vaccine efficacy. That's flat out false. Vaccines are absolutely tested for safety and efficacy before approval. The COVID-19 vaccines went through extensive clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3, before being authorized, and even after that, the monitoring didn't stop. According to the CDC and independent peer-reviewed studies, the mRNA vaccines have been some of the most heavily studied and monitored medical interventions in modern history. Real-time data from millions of doses proved overwhelmingly that the vaccine drastically reduced hospitalizations, severe illnesses, and death, especially during peak waves. RFK Jr. also claimed that 90% of Americans didn't get the most recent booster, as if that means it's ineffective. But vaccine hesitancy doesn't prove a product doesn't work. It just shows how effective fear-mongering has been. And Brian, to his credit, pointed out the simple truth. The data is crystal clear. Unvaccinated people were several times more likely to be hospitalized or die from COVID, especially during Delta and Omicron surges.
Our country had the worst body count from COVID of any country in the world, and one of the most aggressive vaccination schedules. We had 60%.
I would also say that we had the Republican president who was not exactly advocating for vaccinations or even taking the virus itself seriously. I mean, Donald Trump was downplaying the severity of the virus, but it became politicized.
Now you're talking crazy talk. But let me just finish this.
It became completely politicized, and there was a clear delineation.
President Trump brags about the vaccine as the miracle of his administration, the Operation Warp Speed, the greatest accomplishment of his administration. So he wasn't hostile to the vaccine. He was doing whatever Anthony Fauci
There was a clear partisan divide in terms of people who would take the vaccine. But I'll let you go. Go ahead.
Let's just talk about data. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in our country. We only had 4.2% of the world's population. So why isn't somebody explaining to us why we had the highest death rate in the world? We were told that Haiti and Nigeria were going to get wiped out from COVID. Haiti had a 1.3% vaccination rate. It had a death rate from COVID, 1/200th of our death rate. Nigeria had a 1.4% vaccination rate. It had a death rate from COVID of 14 per million population. We had a death rate of 3,000 per million population. So there's no correlation between vaccination and death counts. In fact, the best studies, like the Cleveland Clinic study, which is 56,000 patients, one of the biggest studies, shows that people who got vaccinated were more likely to get COVID. There is no study that shows that COVID had a beneficial impact on deaths. I know that you're told that. This is orthodoxy, but the studies just simply don't exist. And the clinical trial study is never measured for that. In fact, Pfizer's clinical study, which is the one that is made public, showed that people in the placebo group were 23% less likely to die than people in the vaccine group. So if you got vaccinated, you're 23% more likely to die of all causes over the next 6 months, with a 500% increase in cardiac arrest. We're now seeing a whole generation of kids who are dying from cardiac arrest on the playing fields. We're seeing athletes drop dead on the playing fields at rates we've never seen in history, and nobody is explaining that. And the press, the liberal media, is not asking the questions, was that person vaccinated and does this? We're seeing 2 of the 4 vaccines have now been pulled because of pericarditis, myocarditis, thrombocytopenia, which is blood clots. We're seeing larger excess deaths last year after vaccination with no COVID than during the height of COVID. So nobody can explain this, but what you were saying about a decline in deaths simply because of the vaccination, that data simply do not exist.
Well, I would disagree with that, but I'm also not a doctor.
Show me the data.
Show me
the data. Show me the study that you're relying on.
I do have to ask, is it your position then that the politicization of the virus, of the vaccine, had zero impact on survival rates in the aftermath of COVID?
RFK threw out his usual greatest hits. The US had a high COVID death count despite vaccines. Countries like Haiti and Nigeria did better with low vaccination rates, and that the COVID vaccine somehow caused more harm than good. He even brought up that old debunked narrative about athletes dropping dead on the field. It was like a highlight reel of anti-vax Reddit threads, but Brian didn't let it slide. He pushed back with the obvious. The US pandemic response was a mess, thanks in part of political games and disinformation. It wasn't the vaccine that failed, it was the lack of unity and leadership. While other countries had national strategies, we had governors arguing over mask mandates and Trump downplaying the virus. And when RFK tried to suggest there's no data showing vaccines worked, that's just not true at all. There's tons of it. Multiple studies have shown vaccines saved millions of lives. Hospitalizations and deaths dropped dramatically among vaccinated groups, especially during Delta and Omicron. The data is there. Just because it doesn't show up on a meme doesn't mean it doesn't exist. At the end of the day, Brian handled the chaos like a pro. He didn't get flustered, didn't take the bait, he just kept asking for facts. And that's the energy we need more of when it comes to calling out this kind of nonsense. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out Ground News in the description down below.